The passage we're discussing today is again quite lengthy, and for this reason, we'll not read it in its entirety here at the beginning of our time together. The passage we're considering can be found in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verses 2 through 29, and we'll begin by reading only Deuteronomy chapter 29, verses 2 through 9. This is the word of Yahweh. Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, "You have seen all that Yahweh did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land. The great trials that your eyes saw, the signs and those great wonders. But to this day Yahweh has not given you a mind to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. I have led you 40 years in the wilderness. The clothes on your back have not worn out, and the sandals on your feet have not worn out. You've not eaten bread, and you've not drunk wine or strong drink, so that you may know that I am Yahweh your Elohim. When you came to this place, King Sihon of Heshbon and King Og of Bashan came out against us for battle, but we defeated them. We took their land and gave it as an inheritance to the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Therefore, diligently observe the words of this covenant, in order that you may succeed in everything that you do." In his speech at the Second Virginia Convention in Richmond on March 23, 1775, Patrick Henry has been credited with proclaiming, "Give me liberty or give me death." Perhaps surprisingly, the Christian scriptures teach that true liberty is death. God's first words to humanity, as recorded in the first two chapters of Genesis, were these: "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of the earth, and every tree with its seed and its fruit. You shall have them for food. You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall die." From the beginning, God placed restrictions on humanity's liberty and freedom. Humans were never intended to have absolute freedom or absolute liberty. In the beginning, God restricted us with guidelines and sets of responsibilities. It was the serpent who first suggested that God was enslaving us, not for our good, but for his own secretive purposes. Genesis chapter 3 verses 1 through 6 has preserved the encounter as follows. "Now the serpent was more crafty than any other wild animal that Yahweh Elohim had made. He said to the woman, 'Did Elohim say, you shall not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, 'We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but Elohim said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the middle of the garden, nor shall you touch it, or you shall die.' But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not die, for Elohim knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like gods, knowing good and evil.' So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate." The serpent suggested to the first humans that disobedience would gain them liberty from God's restrictions. Of course, he also lied to them, telling them that they would not suffer the consequence of death. Now, perhaps the serpent understood God to a degree and suspected that God would not kill them instantaneously, but would slow their decay, delaying the death of the human race so that some of their descendants might be saved. Whether the serpent predicted this outcome or not, it is what has occurred, and because of God's mercy, the serpent's lie may have appeared true to Eve and to Adam at first. After all, they did not die within 24 hours of eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Instead, God imprisoned them on day 6 of creation, banning them from entering his rest on day 7. And, as God had warned, eventually they did die. Because of the seizing of liberty, life became difficult, temporary, and fleeting. Give me liberty or give me death indeed. The allure of false religions is the liberty they allow to indulge one's ego, curiosities, and fleshly desires. Of course, this allure is largely smoke and mirrors because all religious expressions come with their own peculiar sets of restrictions. Even purely secular social and economic systems such as scientism or humanism or capitalism or socialism exclude certain beliefs and behaviors. There is no true liberty. All personal freedom is dependent on the adoption of certain beliefs and behaviors at the exclusion of others. All religions, all philosophies, all systems which intend to persuade people to adopt them must deal with the capacity in each of us for self-determination. Some systems achieve this by brute force, that is, through war, conquest, oppression, and the tyrannical exercise of authority. But most achieve these ends by what has been called more recently bait and switch tactics. Sadly, even Christianity has gotten in on this racket in the last several centuries. In any case, bait and switch tactics place the reward before the cost, and the reward in nearly every case strokes the ego, piques the curiosity, and promises fleshly pleasure. God refused to engage in bait and switch tactics. God did not require Israel to sign a Faustian pact before he agreed to deliver them from slavery in ancient Egypt. God delivered them with no agreement at all, not even that of faith in him. And when Israel arrived at Mount Sinai, and God offered a covenant to them, he did not require them to agree to its conditions. They were free to leave Sinai as newly freed slaves if they wished. However, if they wished to continue walking with God and to receive the promises God had made to Abraham, they would need to follow him into the covenant. And the covenant did not put the blessings and curses front and center. God began with the requirements, that is, with the 10 Commandments, and specified all the stipulations of the covenant first. Only after all had been stated did God specify the consequences of signing and then reneging on the covenant promises. In short, the obligations of walking with God were all too clear to Israel, and in many seasons of the nation's history, they proved too restrictive for the people's tastes. The presentations of false religions were and are different, and it was for this reason that Israel was often tempted to change their allegiances. As we explored in discussions 2 and 3 of this series through Deuteronomy, the kings Og and Sihon, mentioned in Deuteronomy 29:7, were descended from the Rephaim, and the Rephaim were a group of people who had increased their stature, power, and civilization by deliberate cooperation with fallen spiritual beings, the group that St. Paul the Apostle would later call in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Here in Deuteronomy chapter 29, God wanted to remind Israel what had happened to those who followed the serpent's call to liberty, to the freedom to do as one wished without the interference of a higher authority. God defeated Og and Sihon and gave their land and wealth to 3 of the tribes of Israel. Then God said, "Therefore diligently observe the words of this covenant in order that you may succeed in everything that you do." Those who pursue the liberty to live as they wish without reference to any authority outside of their own wisdom and desires may prosper for a little while because of God's merciful forbearance. But eventually, God warned Israel, the cost of liberty from God is annihilation. Then through Moses, God continued as follows in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verses 10 through 15. You stand assembled today, all of you, before Yahweh your Elohim, the leaders of your tribes, your elders, and your officials, all the men of Israel, your children, your women, and the aliens who are in your camp, both those who cut your wood and those who draw your water, to enter into the covenant of Yahweh your Elohim, sworn by an oath which Yahweh your Elohim is making with you today, in order that he may establish you today as his people, and that he may be your Elohim, as he promised you and as he swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I am making this covenant, sworn by an oath, not only with you who stand here with us today before Yahweh our Elohim, but also with those who are not here with us today. In these verses, God offered Israel an opportunity to reclaim what Eve and Adam had forsaken. God offered the people of Israel the opportunity to enter back into a submitted relationship with him. This is what it means for Israel to be God's people and for God to be their God. God was asking them to willingly submit themselves to his leadership, and in response, he would restore to them what they had lost when they were banished from Eden. The options placed before the Israelites were life and submission, or liberty and eventual death. But God recognized that the calls of liberty and licentiousness, which were sent out by false gods and other religions, would remain as enticing in the ears of Israel as the serpents had been in the ears of Eve and of Adam. And so through Moses, God continued in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verses 16 through 18. You know how we lived in the land of Egypt, and how we came through the midst of the nations through which you passed. You have seen their detestable things, the filthy idols of wood and stone, of silver and gold that were among them. It may be that there is among you a man or a woman or a family or tribe whose heart is already turning away from Yahweh our Elohim to serve the Elohim of those nations. It may be that there is among you a root sprouting poisonous and bitter growth. It might seem improbable to us that Israel would ever be tempted to worship the gods of Egypt. After all, Israel had been slaves in Egypt. Why would they want to worship the gods of those who had enslaved them? Of course, much of the extant evidence with respect to Egyptian religious rituals indicate that they were often quite raucous, sensual, and carnal. However, that is not the primary appeal of false religions. The primary appeal of false religions is both control and liberty from absolute claims. The gods of Egypt and the gods of the nations of Canaan were many, and no one god had final say over a person's life. Even more, these gods were thought to be susceptible to manipulation. By appeasing any one or group of them, it was believed that one could exercise a measure of control. Whereas the God of Israel was one God above all other gods and had written a covenant in stone which he expected his people to follow and to which he committed himself absolutely. The false gods of the nations were multiple, competing, mutable, and changeable. They could be bribed, they could be coerced, they could be cajoled, they could be enticed, and if need be, they could be exchanged. At its core, the allure of false religions is the liberty to exercise some measure of control over one's life and circumstances without having to deny one's fleshly desires consistently. Of course, false religions had restrictions, but those restrictions were malleable and could be massaged and changed over time, or even abandoned by gaining the favor of a new god or goddess. The covenant of God, on the other hand, as we've noted, was written in stone, and the God of that covenant purported to be the same yesterday, today, and forever. And even more, God warned the Israelites that he could not be played or manipulated as the other purported gods could. Through Moses, God continued as follows in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verses 19 through 28. All who hear the words of this oath and bless themselves, thinking in their hearts, we are safe, even though we go our own stubborn ways, thus bringing disaster on moist and dry alike. Yahweh will be unwilling to pardon them, for Yahweh's anger and passion will smoke against them. All the curses written in this book will descend on them, and Yahweh will blot out their names from under heaven. Yahweh will single them out from all the tribes of Israel for calamity, in accordance with all the curses of the covenant written in this book of the law. The next generation, your children who rise up after you, as well as the foreigner who comes from a distant country, will see the devastation of that land and the afflictions with which Yahweh has afflicted it. All its soil burned out by sulfur and salt, nothing planted, nothing sprouting, unable to support any vegetation, like the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which Yahweh destroyed in his fierce anger. They, and indeed all the nations, will wonder, why has Yahweh done thus to this land? What caused this great display of anger? They will conclude it is because they abandoned the covenant of Yahweh, the Elohim of their ancestors, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. They turned and served other Elohim, worshiping them, Elohim whom they had not known and whom he had not allotted to them. So the anger of Yahweh was kindled against that land, bringing on it every curse written in this book. Yahweh uprooted them from their land in anger, fury, and great wrath, and cast them into another land, as is now the case. To be free from the God of Israel, as humanity has learned in every generation in the wake of humanity's exile from Eden, is death. God is life, and only God can impart and sustain life. There is no life without God, and there is no life that can persist if God does not maintain it. And life, according to God, may have been given freely, but it is not defined by freedom or by liberty. Life can only persist within the boundaries God has established for it. Outside of those boundaries is only weeping and gnashing of teeth, in the words of Jesus, or formlessness and emptiness, in the language of Genesis. God may choose to sustain the lives of those who live in darkness temporarily, but he will not do so indefinitely. As God said in the days of Noah in Genesis chapter 6, verse 3, Then Yahweh said, My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever. The judgment of God is the punishment of reaping what one sows. Destruction is the consequence of leaving the habitable space God has created and retreating again into the chaos, the darkness, out of which God called us when He created us. What God warned Israel was that the call of false gods and false religions and false philosophies and false calls to freedom and liberty are sirens' calls, leading us back to the nothingness out of which God called us in the beginning. To live as the nations live is to pave a road back to the formlessness and emptiness of primordial creation. And God warned Israel that not only would He not protect them from this consequence, but if they persisted, He would speed them on their journey into it. And so, Moses makes a statement in direct contradiction to the serpent's whisper to Eve in Eden, when he said in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29, The secret things belong to Yahweh our Elohim, but the revealed things belong to us and to our children forever, to observe all the words of this law. The serpent had suggested to Eve that the secret things could be taken through knowledge, that one did not have to wait upon the Lord God for revelation and education and discipleship, that one could uncover the secret things and by acquiring them become like God on one's own terms. The serpent speaks these words still to humanity, but perhaps no longer in the call to false religions. Instead, the supposed secular pursuits of science and technology are the means by which humanity eats of its own accord from the tree of knowledge. But the call of the serpent is the same. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is freedom. Knowledge is true liberty. Knowledge is all that separates man from God. But Moses reminded Israel of the truth. The secret things belong to Yahweh our Elohim. We need only to live into what He has chosen to reveal to us, and we will live. May those who have ears to hear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. Amen.